60-Minute Gamer here, and as the title says, I just checked off a bucket list item by visiting the Galloping Ghost in Brookfield, Illinois. Hit up the arcade and the pinball section of the Galloping Ghost, and the first minute and 45 seconds is going to be me just walking through both of these buildings and letting you see every arcade machine they have in just a sped up power walkthrough. And the Galloping Ghost is the world's largest arcade, and you can see that it just doesn't disappoint. There are just tons and tons of arcade cabinets just jammed in this one location. And the cost for this is $25 for the day. You keep your receipt on you, and you can go out and get something to eat and come back. You can't bring food in or drinks in, and there is absolutely no gum allowed in this arcade. And for additional $5, you can get access to the Galloping Ghost pinball area, which is in another building 2 blocks away. And this was a 6-hour trip from southern Minnesota to Illinois, and this is just right outside of Chicago in Brookfield. And when I got there, I made sure I stayed there for about 6 hours of filming and gameplay. In the Galloping Ghost arcade, there is over 1,000 video games, and in the Galloping Ghost pinball area, there's about 60 games, maybe a little bit more. And I was shooting to get the arcade around 11 o'clock, but I made it there a little bit later than that, and it was a good thing I got there early because there is limited room between all these arcade machines. It is just jam-packed with games. So after I paid my entry fee, I just made sure I backed up to the door and walked in just like I was walking in for the first time, so you guys can experience this just as I did. And it is so overwhelming, the number of arcade games they have there. I just saw Virtual Cop there, and later on during the day when I got further in the back, I saw Time Crisis, and for some odd reason I thought, why do they have 2 Time Crisis in this arcade? And then I realized, no, that was Virtual Cop. That wasn't Time Crisis. And it's so easy to get your mind just turned around because it is overwhelming here. There are so many arcade games in this one location that it's going to be so easy to get overwhelmed. And as you walk through, you kind of see that they have some organization to the way they place these arcade machines. And you see the Legend of Kage was out of order. There's a grid. There's actually 2 grids that are out of order here. And it's expected. Things go down. CRTs need repaired or they just die. And what's the cost of maintaining these machines? It's got to be an insane amount of money. Now there's an NBA Jam Extreme right there. I have never seen that. Didn't get a play on that one when I was there. I'll have to get back to play on that one or look it up. There is a Sonic game right there with trackballs. And here is War of the Worlds, and it is not working right there. You can see that. Behind us is some Sega games. And it's remarkable that these things still are working. And these were like holographic games, and it used some technology where it just projected the image right up on the playfield there. And no matter what angle you looked at it from, you were always looking at it straight on. And it was kind of a neat thing when it came out. And the internet actually says this came out in 1991, and I could have swore I played this when I was younger than that age. And not that the internet's ever wrong on anything, but these machines are really beat up. They're not restored. You can see there's chips in them everywhere, and I guess that's what you get when you do a pretty glossy white veneer on a arcade cabinet. But it was kind of cool because it just contrasted with the black mirror that they had in there and made those holograms stand out a little bit more. And here's a couple more machines not working, but right next to it, it is Contra Evolution 2011. And this was a cool machine. I sat down and played that one for a while later on in the day, and wish I had a buddy there with me because we would have sat there and played it till we completed it. And I try to leave the audio on in the arcade so you kind of get that feel of the background of the arcade, but you can hear in the background there's something that's just buzzing really loud, and one of the machines just died right when we were walking into the room, and it was just screaming. There was something wrong with the machine, and it was howling, and it's going to be up here on the right there, bloody woof. I just said bloody wolf just died, and it was loud. And in this room, there was a lot of arcade machines that I really just did not know about. You know, there were some that I did, but the majority of them I had never heard of. And a lot of the CRTs were in need of some TLC. This one needed a rejuvenation. It was just really dim and hard to see, and especially, you know, towards the front of the building where the windows were letting in the light in, that probably didn't help the matter any, but definitely needed to be some TLC into some of these CRTs. And these arcade cabinets are definitely well played, and I couldn't imagine what it would cost to repair all these. And I know that I'm comparing in with some of the arcades that I've been to where they've actually restored these games. They've restored the cabinets, they've repainted them, reshelled them, they put new graphics on the outside of them, the boards have been repaired. You know, this would be a huge task to bring every one of these machines up to brand new status. And I was just puzzled of Galaga 3 because I don't remember Galaga 3 ever coming out. I remember Gapless coming out, and this looked similar to that, so I looked it up online, and sure enough, Gapless was changed over to Galaga 3 just to get more people to play the machine. And later in the video, you'll probably get to see a Galaga 88. We'll walk by that one a little bit later. And as usual, you can comment down below, especially if you see a video game that you just really loved here. Maybe it was something that was a cheap thing that, you know, you'd only find in a laundromat, and you played that a ton. Comment down below. And, you know, being in my 50s, I got a different perspective than most people. And I can remember putting quarters into arcade machines. We didn't put tokens in them. It was quarters that started out that way. And when they moved up to getting these arcades out there with tokens, the way to get you in was to get you 25 tokens for $5. That would get you in. And every once in a while, if you showed up after 7 o'clock, you would get 30 tokens for $5. And those are the arcades you wanted to hit up. So paying $25 to get in and play all the games you could play in the time that you were there is a great deal. I couldn't tell you how many quarters I put into a Pac-Man machine growing up, or a Missile Command, or an Asteroids. And there's the evidence of the Galaga 3 actually being a gapless cabinet at one time. And I played a crap ton of games growing up. I have no idea where all that cash came from, but I ended up going to the 7-Eleven, the Video Champ, the mall arcades, a Nickelodeon on the east side of Des Moines, and we played tons and tons of games. And I can remember having a paper out as a kid and actually getting allowance, but just doesn't seem like it would add up that all the amount of games that I played as a kid would come from just those two things. And I did start working when I was 16, so from 86 on, that would say I had some money for games then. I worked at a Pizza Hut when I was 16, and I can remember they had one of those red tent Nintendo DS units where you'd sit down and play. They had a Super Mario Brothers on one side and Excite Bike on the other side, and I can remember just chucking tip money into there every break I got. How did you start playing video games? Was it a family member that got you going? Was it a brother, a sister? Was it your mom or dad? Comment down below on how you started playing video games. And I know there's going to be somebody out there that's going to bring up, you know, just why would you go and pay $25 to play old video games? You can emulate these at home. I can just hear them right now. Well, I got all these games at home. Why would I go to an arcade and play those games? You do you. I'm going to do me. I'm telling you what, I have a blast stepping back in time and experiencing all these arcade games. And a lot of these games have a different experience as you're playing it. And I love video games. I love buying them. I love collecting them. But going to these arcade games and, playing them the way the developers intended you to play them in the arcade is just so freaking awesome. And as an example, I want to bring up back in 1983, Sega came out with Star Trek, the Strategic Operations Simulator. I think that's what it was called. And they had two units. They had a stand-up one, and then they had a sit-down was the other one. And about 10 blocks from my house, and it had to have been around 83 or 84, right when the video game crash happened, somebody opened up an arcade called the Video Champ, and it was flipping awesome. They redid the whole inside of it. It was just beautiful. It had black lights in there. It had different, areas where the games are at. And in this arcade, they had that Star Trek sit-down game, and it was flipping awesome. And when you sat down, it was like you were Captain Kirk sitting in, his chair. On your left armrest, you had the spinner that would allow you to move the Enterprise left to right and spin it around. And on your right hand, you had your fire buttons, your photon torpedoes, and your shields were all on that, on your right hand side. And it was a blast playing that machine. And it doesn't compare. I had that game on the VIC-20, and I enjoyed it on the VIC-20, but it didn't compare to playing it at the arcade and sitting in the captain's chair. Star Wars, the arcade game, was another one that was, you just have to experience that at the original hardware. I've had that, on the Sega 32X. I've had it on the Atari 5200. It's been ported over so many flipping times, but playing on the original was just pure joy. There were so many rip-off games that you were battling and trying to shoot these little fake TIE fighter things. And when Atari came out with Star Wars, the arcade game, and you got to sit down and play that, they had two machines just like the Star Trek. You can sit down or you can stand up. But you would wait in line to experience the sit-down one because you were in the cockpit. You were Luke. You were battling, Darth Vader himself, and it was just a great feeling. And you can't get that from emulation. But when you sit down and you rack your knees on this little sit-down game, oh my gosh, you're still having that fun, and it's like taking a step back in time. And Tron and Disc of Tron was the same way for me. They only had stand-up arcade units of those games, but walking up to one of those and getting that blue glow and having, the music of Tron play loud in those speakers, it was just joy. And the controller and the spinner was flipping awesome. It was just something that you can't experience at home outside of a one-up cabinet. You want to play this on the original hardware. And I can't tell you when the Video Champ closed down. I know that the video game crash happened and arcades started dying off around that time, and there wasn't too many of them available, and the ones that were available were getting really ratty. And I think a lot of our quarters were now being saved for home consoles, for home games. We wanted to play them at home, and the arcades were dying off then. Do you remember the first game that cost more than a quarter to play? I do. I remember putting 50 cents into a Dragon's Lair machine, and that was a Laserdisc Don Bluth type of animation, and it was really cool. But it was just a full motion video style game where you just pushed a direction and it would give you a bleep, and if you didn't time it right, you were dead. But don't fear, you can continue for another quarter. Was that the birth of the Quarter Muncher? I'm not sure. I do remember that you could continue Moon Patrol. If you died in a location, you had a timer and you can put another quarter in before that timer went down and continue right where you left off. That's a really good question to ask. I wonder if anybody has done the research on that to find out what the first quarter munching video game was. Hey, are you still listening right now? Really? Wow, if you're listening, why haven't you hit the like and subscribe button yet? You might as well. Hey, I appreciate each and every one of you listening. I hope you've enjoyed this step back in time, and it's kind of a little show and tell with the little history of my life in video games as well. Today, there seemed to be a resurgence of arcades, and this makes me very happy and hopeful. I have seen retro arcade bars pop up here and there that feature pay-as-you-play video game cabinets and pinball cabinets. They feature games from Pong to more modern-day games, but most of them are staying with the retro games from the 80s to the 2000s. This amazes me because I'm old enough to experience the rise and fall of the arcades as we knew them, being a child of the 70s and 80s. As a kid, I could remember arcades and their primitive style games before Pong was introduced to us back in 1972. Of course, I can't remember playing an original Pong machine in the arcade, but I remember the pinball machines, shooting gallery games, and even skee-ball that frequently were offered up in these arcades. Growing up in the Des Moines area, I can remember an arcade called the Nickelodeon on the northeast side of Des Moines, which offered some of these old games and newer game machines. It was quite a jaunt to get there, and we usually had to rely on the kindness of someone's parents to get us there to play. When I turned 16, I could get there to play on my own by the means of my 1966 Volkswagen Bug. By then, the video game crash had already happened, and the Nintendo NES was just fresh on the scene, and people started to invest in gaming at home, and the arcades became less of a destination that people wanted to seek out for entertainment. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's head back to the 70s where malls were getting very popular, and in every mall, you had to have an arcade. It was a must. On the south side of Des Moines, we had Aladdin's Castle, where I can remember my dad taking his truck to the Sears in the mall to have it worked on. You can't see that today. Think about it. This mall had two major retailers who had automotive repair. One was a Sears and the other was Montgomery Ward's. We went to the mall for automotive repair, where then we could wait out the repair by either shopping, eating, or even killing some time in the mall's arcade. This arcade was the arcade where I learned how to play games. Today, this mall is barely a shadow of its former self. At this arcade, it housed a large amount of pinball machines, air hockey tables, and video games were titles like Gunfight, Circus, Breakout, a lot of primitive driving games, Stunt Cycle. They had war games like Anti-Aircraft and Seawolf. In 1976, we had our first video games are ruining our kids moment when Death Race was introduced to the arcades. It featured two-player drivers that went around a track with humanoid figures on the track that you could run over with your vehicle. When you hit these so-called gremlins, they were replaced by tombstones that you had to avoid for the rest of the race. You can play Death Race at the Galloping Ghost. This machine is here. This machine was one of the first conversions of the existing arcade cabinet. Its original game was actually Destruction Derby and was later refitted to sell more of the pre-existing unsold game cabinets. A few years later, in the 1980s, Missile Command would come out, and when these machines were not producing any money, two young MIT students made a modification board to add new speeds, alien targets, and new colors to the game. There is a great video you can find on YouTube with the story of General Computers done by Play Value. I will drop a link in the description below. 1977 would bring us something that was a game changer to the video games of the 70s. It was a little movie called Star Wars. I can remember my dad sending my brother to get me from our local dirt bike path down by a creek. I was full of dirt and mud. I was having a blast and didn't want to go see some stupid war movie. My 7-year-old self had no freaking clue what a life-changing event this would be. I protested as my dad tried to explain the movie to me as he hosed me down in the backyard to clean off all the mud and dirt on myself, so we could hurry down to our best theater to see Star Wars for the first of many, many times. Needless to say, I loved the movie. Everyone did. The playground at school was a buzz of talks of Wookiees, droids, stormtroopers, and X-Wings. Wasn't long after this, we saw Star Wars looking rip-off arcade games in our arcades. 1 year later, we would be introduced to Space Invaders. I can remember walking up to the arcade at the mall and hearing the sounds of the arcade. In 1978, you could hear something new added to it. It was a menacing sound of the Space Invaders making their side-by-side march down towards the bottom of the screen. It was iconic and right up there with the theme from Jaws. My dad first introduced me to Space Invaders, where I saw him put his quarter up on the marquee to wait for his turn to play. He must have heard about it from some friends at work. My dad was a great outdoorsman. His free time was mostly made up of fishing and hunting, so this was not a norm for him. He then gave my brother and I some quarters to play some games, as well as he waited to play Space Invaders. The arcades were soon to make a huge change. Mechanical games were being moved out to make room for these new games. Soon we would see Asteroids, Lunar Lander, Space Wars, Starfire. It was a blatant ripoff of Star Wars where you got to shoot down TIE Fighter-looking spaceships. And oddly enough, the Atari made a 2-player football where you controlled the X's and O's by the means of a trackball. This game was recently included in the Atari 50, the anniversary collection. I do have to say that it loses its dynamic of the game in the home console presentation. This was just one of those games that you had to experience playing in the arcade. The sounds of the players violently spinning the trackball were just something you had to experience firsthand. My high school, we actually had a student lounge where you had to be an upperclassman to enter it. No freshmen, no sophomores were allowed, to enter it. And it contained a small amount of games, including an Atari football game. This was a popular game there, and I wonder where this machine ended up finding a home in its later years. I hope it was rehomed and didn't make its way to a local landfill. I can honestly say I had more fun playing this football game than I ever do at playing a Madden game in present time. Yeah, Madden is far superior in every way, but I like to say I have some great memories of violently spinning that trackball in desperation of beating my opponent. You actually broke a sweat playing a video game. These arcade games of the 70s were the ones that hooked us for life. In the later 70s, we were introduced to home consoles. First came all the Pong clones, then came the driving games and the light gun shooters. Then in 1977, the maker of all our favorite arcade games introduced the Atari VCS, soon to be renamed as the Atari 2600. Sure, 5 years earlier, Magnavox and Ralph Baer introduced the home video game console, first called the Odyssey, but it was more like a complicated video board game that included game pieces and screen overlays, where lights would appear on your screen under the overlays. It was the first on the scene and offered ping pong before Atari's successful Pong was released, and a light gun game, but timing is everything, and the video game buzz didn't come until years later. In fact, the 1972 Odyssey was just a manufactured version of Ralph Baer's 1967 brown box. Talk about way before in timing. Most of the arcade classics were from Atari in the 70s, and the arrival of the VCS was purely awesome and a must-have for everyone that wanted to play their favorite games at home. And when we went to the mall, we would run from the front of the mall to the Atari kiosk at the Sears in hopes that there would be no other kids there. If there were a line of kids, we would slide down and play the various versions of Pong clones they had or other electronic games to sample until the Atari or the Sears VCS was available for play. The games they first released were titles such as Combat, Air Sea Battle, Indy 500, Street Racer, amongst others. Not the current hit titles that we were in the arcades. Not the current hit titles that were in the arcades, so we were still frequenting the arcades and dropping quarters into the arcade machines. We didn't get an Atari VCS until close to the 80s when Space Invaders was released. This port of the game was a bit off from the arcade, but still challenging and fun. Missile Command and Asteroid would soon follow. These games were simple versions that looked and played different than their arcade counterparts. We would still be dropping our quarters into the arcade machines. In 1980, the quarter shortage would be caused by a new arcade game that was giving us all a fever. Yes, Pac-Man had officially been delivered to the arcades in North America in May of 1980. This is about 5 months later than the Japanese release date. Not only did we get the Empire Strikes Back in 1980, but we also got Pac-Man. The playground was now abuzz of Vader being Luke's father, and whether it was a truth or a lie. We would have to wait until next movie was out to verify that it was indeed the truth. And the talk on the playground was how far you could get in Pac-Man, and what was your high score. Smack talking began and would have to be settled at the next school skate party, where you could meet up at the arcade in the skating rink to battle it out and shut up the smack talking little punk. If you couldn't wait until then, you could bike down to the local 7-Eleven where they had 3 arcade machines to play. Video games were not just at arcades in the 80s, they were everywhere. Restaurants, convenience stores, gas stations, grocery stores, laundromats, and various other locations. If you got your butt kicked in the game you played, you could actually go to a bookstore. Yes, a bookstore, and pick up tips and tricks books to help you become a better player. It was common to visit your Walden's Book or B. Dalton's bookstore and find kids in the video game section reading those tips and trick books for free while sitting on the floor. Those little cheaters actually had the same idea as I did. The 80s were just booming with hit video game titles and birthed many video game franchises that are still alive and well today. Battlezone, Berserk, Frenzy, Centipede, Galaga, Star Wars, Punch-Out, Robotron 2084, Spy Hunter, Pole Position, Zaxxon, Donkey Kong, Frogger, Joust, Tempest, Rally X, amongst many more, were rounding out what is considered now the golden age of gaming. Track and Field was released in 1983, and it was such a fun competitive game that that the buttons had to be modified to keep people from slamming them so hard that they broke them, causing owners to lose money. So most arcades place these risers around the buttons that force you to use the tips of your fingers instead of slapping them with 2 or 3 fingers. When you walked in an arcade, you could hear the sounds of the running action and the jumping action being hit. You knew that Track and Field was in that arcade before you even saw it. Now, sadly to say that these home translations to the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision, they really sucked. An example was the Pac-Man home arcade games. Coleco had came out with these little mini arcade LED games that were less than stellar. They looked like actual arcade cabinets that you could play tabletop or in your lap. I was jealous when I saw some of my friends that received these as gifts. That is until I got to play them and saw how bad these games were. They sucked compared to the arcade games. In 1982, Atari acquired the right to do the home Pac-Man game for their Atari 2600 system. Everyone and their brother pre-ordered this game. Everyone was super excited for Pac-Man to enter the home market. That is until we got it. The game was so far from the Pac-Man experience that this was a letdown. The sounds were horrendous. Dots were now wafers, and the ghosts were just ghosts of their arcade self. The 2600 was so underpowered and placed near impossible limits to the graphics and capabilities to port arcade games over to the Atari home console. We saw this time after time when these arcade games got ported over to the home consoles. When Donkey Kong had its release to the 2600 and the ColecoVision in 1982, Atari drew the short straw. The system limitations showed its age, and the ColecoVision just had a far superior game and system. Then entered the video game crash. They say that E.T. was the reason the video game crash happened, but I'm not so sure. Was the writing on the wall during the early phases of development of E.T.? I grew up in this time, and I was seeing that my Atari 2600 was oversaturated with terribly made games. A ton of them, too. Atari had the 5200 come out in 1982 as well, but it was expensive. Although the games looked great, the controller was terrible. No matter how good the games looked, our parents did not want to invest in another Atari that didn't play the old games that we had already purchased. Around that same time, the home computer market started to gain momentum, and it was easier for our parents to invest in a newly Commodore VIC-20 or even a Commodore 64 with more memory. The video game consoles were fizzling out, which then was reducing the trips to the arcades. The golden age of gaming was considered from 1978 to 1983. In 1980, the video game business declined from $8 billion to $5 billion in 1983. After the arcade stopped generating the insane amount of money and they stopped buying new games because they were not sound investments, things began to die off a little bit. In North America, the number of arcades doubled from 1980 to 1982, reaching over 10,000 arcades. In 1998, that number dropped to 4,000. In 2023, this number is back up to 6,200. And I believe that the numbers dropped in the 90s because of the release of powerful home console systems that offered near arcade quality games. Systems such as Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, Sony PlayStation, and even, don't laugh, but the Atari Jaguar. These systems challenged the way arcade games were made. This was considered the fifth generation of gaming consoles. 32-bit and 64-bit game consoles were bringing arcade quality games to our homes. Yes! I air quoted 64-bit as I said that last part. Even though there was a reduction of people visiting arcades, the 90s still turned out some great games. Fighting games, beat-em-ups, shooters, light gun games, driving simulators were just huge. Titles that are legendary franchise to this day are all on the list. Mortal Kombat, Street Fighters, Tekken, Cruisin', Crazy Taxi, NBA Jam, NFL Blitz, Time Crisis, Marvel vs. Capcom, The Simpsons, Daytona, House of the Dead, Dance Dance Revolution, and even Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in Time were among some of the releases of the 1990s. These are all games that are still alive on our consoles today. In the year 2000, we started seeing a decade of the decline of games that were released in the arcade. Looking through the list of games released in the arcademuseum.com, I'm really not seeing anything but sequels and a crap ton of redemption games being made. Moving on to 2010, the next decade's list on the same site, I am seeing the same trend except for one thing. That one thing is there is a crap ton of new pinball cabinets being made, more than the last 3 decades of arcade games on this list. One notable game in this decade was a Star Wars Battle Pod. That was a freaking awesome game that cost a pretty penny to play. I can remember when the Mall of America still had their arcade and the Battle Pod was in there. It was placed right up front in eyeshot of walking by. It was a reason to stop in and play. That game was released in 2014. When I move up to the next decade, in our current decade, I only see 5 games added to this database. I know this database is incomplete, which I'm not surprised by that. There are a crap ton of pinball cabinets not entered in yet, and one of my all-time favorite video games that I played at last year's Midwest Gaming Classic is not on the list. This was a VR game that you sat down to play, and the sit-down area had hydraulics that moved you as you played the game. This game was Godzilla Kaiju Wars VR. This game was phenomenal, but at the price tag of over $50,000 without the spectator monitors above the unit, kind of made it not something the average person can afford. What arcade could afford this unit? That's too bad, because this was an arcade shooter that was just pure fun and immersive. I'm still hoping one day we could see this on a VR headset for the average consumer. Going to an arcade in 2025 still feeds me nostalgia berries and satisfies the gamer in me. Even if it is just a retro arcade, stepping foot in the world's largest arcade was so cool. I would certainly make the trip again. Next time, no filming and actually playing the whole freaking time. My initial reaction was, wow, this place is kind of ghetto and not finely polished. But that was soon replaced with an overwhelming feeling as I walked the sea of never-ending games. When I ran into a game that I totally forgot, from my childhood, the emotions and the memories came pouring back in really fast. I was overtaken by childish joy. It wasn't the game that I was hoping to find or was dying to play, but it was one that I played numerous times before moving on to the next one to play. It was just the excitement of reconnecting with an old, long-lost friend as we met up again for some more fun. If you ever had a blast playing in an arcade growing up, I highly recommend visiting one of these retro arcades. The Galloping Ghost was just brilliant. I loved it. Bring your whole family. Kids and grandkids will have a blast. There's usually a game for every type of gamer in one of these arcades. And we'll continue to walk around here, and I got the speed of the video kicked up to 2 times the speed to try to get through it. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to see every arcade machine that they have available at the Galloping Ghost. It's so hard to keep track of the different categories of games here. I was just trying to go back and think of some of the ones that I just forgot about. And when I walked by them, I was like, oh my gosh, I remember that game. And it would take forever and a day to put them all in a category. And when you go to one of these arcades, you should be just really enjoying yourself. I have an arcade that's just about 2 hours from my home, and it's a retro arcade, and you pay $20 and you get to go on and play as many games as you want. And I've been up there a couple times, and the second time I went up, I just went and played the games I wanted to play, and I repeatedly would play one game till I got bored with it and then moved on to the other. I really didn't have a mission of trying to play every flipping game in the arcade. I just wanted to kick back and have a good time playing games. And as I entered the arcade, I had seen 2 guys fly by me with, when I was filming, and I could hear them talk about, I think Punisher is back this way. And as I went back to that corner to film and walked by them playing the Punisher, I came back probably about 45 minutes later. They were still there playing the Punisher. I came back an hour and a half later, and they were still there playing the Punisher. These guys knew they had a mission. Their mission was to beat the Punisher. And finally, I did see them move off to another game, and I'm pretty sure these guys finished the Punisher and completed it fully. And some of these cabinets are just huge, man. I couldn't imagine the weight and what work it is to move them into place, or to try to organize them, or to reorganize them when you get something new in there. And I don't know if you noticed when we walked by the Darius games that they had a Japanese Darius game that it sat 4 players in front of this huge screen, and I could not imagine moving that into place and the planning that it would take to figure it out. And we just passed those 2 guys that I was talking about earlier. And those are the 2 guys standing there playing the Punisher. So if you beat the Punisher, guys, and you're actually watching this video, hey, drop me a comment down below. Do a little bragging, man. You guys probably kick butt playing that game. And there's some heavy arcade sit-downs right there to my left. And I think that was an Afterburner. And next to it, see if we come right back down to it, see if anybody remembers what movie featured Rad Racer, because that is a Rad Racer sit-down game right there. And how many movies in the 80s and 90s actually featured video games? Maybe their characters were playing a video game, or the movie was about a video game. If you've got a favorite video game movie, comment down below. I know myself, I laughed my butt off when Iron Man called out in the first Avengers movie to the guy on the helicarrier that was playing Galaga. That man is playing Galaga right there. And I saw somewhere on maybe a Watch Mojo video or something that Robert Downey Jr. actually improvised that whole scene right there. Hey, how many of you made it actually 39 minutes into this video? I bet you not very many of you did, but if you did, why haven't you hit the like button? You might as well hit the like button if you got this far. I appreciate it. It helps build the channel up. This was a costly trip for me, and no matter if I get 10 views, 25 views, or 100 views off this video, I can just say, honestly, this was a trip well worth my time. So I just wanted to share this video with you guys and give you the opportunity, because maybe some of you guys live a little bit more than 6 hours away. Maybe, you know, you're out there on the West Coast and you'll probably never get a chance to come here. I wanted to give you that opportunity just to see at 2025 what games they had available. And if you're going to check this off your bucket list, I just recommend that you set the whole day aside to spend the whole day here at the arcade. You will not regret it. There's a lot of restaurants close by, and it will be just a great time for you.